Hello, I'm David Kerr, Professor of Cancer Medicine from University of Oxford, and today I'd like to discuss how we think that COVID-19 pandemic will impact on our capacity to deliver high-quality cancer clinical research. Before we go on to the research side of it, I'd like to discuss some results which colleagues of ours have published recently in The Lancet from a large collaborative group, which you can see in this slide. They set up a COVID-19 cancer register, which was supported by the large majority of cancer hospitals in the United Kingdom. This was perhaps the most important finding from the survey that was published recently. The main thing was that if we looked at the proportion of patients who died of COVID-19, the red box in this slide, we can see that there is no difference really when we compare those who have had chemotherapy within 4 weeks of the infection compared to those who have not. This is one of the big knee-jerk responses around the world, that we would have to stop all chemotherapy because of perceived dangers around immunosuppression and so on. But it does look as if, in this case, conventional chemotherapy has had no negative impact in terms of mortality from COVID-19. Turning now to what I believe the impact of the pandemic may be in our capacity to perform clinical cancer research. And I think some elements of this will be persistent and lasting. In some ways, not a bad thing. Famously, Winston Churchill said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." And it's quite possible that the COVID-19 pandemic will compel a rational change in terms of how we digitize and collect data for our clinical trials. One of the problems, of course, that presents with us all in immediacy in the middle of the pandemic is what do we do about ongoing clinical trials? Because of self-isolation, because of illness, there may be a lack of clinical staff with the ability to conduct trial activities and visits. Revised use of clinical facilities. We found it very difficult to be able to bring patients through the conventional administration routes in our hospital because so much of the hospital was being given up to COVID preparedness. And of course, access to the tools of the trade that we need to be able to review and to look after patients in clinical trial. Many of these were being reprioritized again in preparation for the expected tsunami of COVID-19 patients. We need to consider the response of the various different actors in the clinical research arena. The host organisation response, this is true of us all, that the safety of the participant is a primary concern. We must always be continually reassessing the risk-benefit ratio, in this particular case regarding continuation of the trial for both ongoing participants, those who have already been recruited and who are maybe halfway through a treatment cycle, and the recruitment of new participants. Potential responses, of course, could just be immediate halt recruitment. It could be to continue with a different approach to delivery. Can we use telephones, computers to try and collect key data points, or just to immediately stop and suspend the trial, so even those patients who are actively engaged in the trial being treated would be suspended. The sponsor's response. Again, we must keep the patient safety at the centre of all that we do, but sponsors, whether it's big pharma, whether it's the biotech industry, the diagnostics industry, whomsoever, they must realise that access to staff, facilities, patients is likely to be very significantly impacted as the hospital gears up to face the large increase in number of COVID-19 patients. Similarly, routine follow-up and monitoring activities, again, are going to be made more difficult because of site staff availability, as already mentioned, social distancing rules. Everything that we take for granted can no longer be done so we have to think of new ways of working. I believe this is a truism of all trials, that data collection should be minimised to essential information only, primary endpoint data and safety reporting until normal capacity resumes. But I generally believe that's a paradigm that should be used for all clinical trials. I'm particularly involved in trials of adjuvant therapy in the UK, and our QUASAR group means quick and simple and reliable. And that means that we keep data collection to a minimum, but we plan to recruit very large numbers of patients, hence the reliability. And that's a paradigm that I would suggest should apply across the board. We would need increased support for trial critical electronic systems, and we'd want flexibility in supporting documentation of protocol deviations. Remote monitoring of the electronic health record is a good idea. There's no question about it. At the moment, I'm running my busy Friday clinics from the kitchen table because I have good remote access to the patient's electronic health record. I can see the most recent results, I can advise the patient accordingly, and I can manage the delivery of complex chemotherapy from the kitchen table and with confidence. I can do it in an area of confidentiality. I'm within my own home. There's nobody looking over my shoulder. There's nobody who can interfere with the rather personal discussions that we have with patients. I think that we should have, as we had in our own hospital trust, explicit instructions about what data will be made available, to whom and to where. Privacy being important and a key element of it. And again, asking that trial participants would consent to any identifiers leaving the site, and the essence again of maintaining confidentiality and being sure that that would be protected. Changes to monitoring visits. Let's use phone calls when and if and where appropriate, rather than in-person study visits. And I think that's one of the key factors which will change forever. I don't see us necessarily going back to face-to-face interactions. If we need to reduce the number and complexity of monitoring visits during COVID-19, then again, we just need to manage the risks associated. If we're doing fewer blood tests, if there are fewer visits to the hospital, we must still ensure that we maintain the safety of the patients in terms of the treatment that we're delivering. And if it's not possible to ensure adequate monitoring of trial participants, we need to think very hard indeed about whether we should just suspend that trial. I said earlier, don't let a crisis go to waste, and I'm re-emphasising that I think that remote video teleconferencing is here to stay. I talked already about our quick and simple and reliable approach. I think there's a lot of fascinating work going on repurposing anti-cancer drugs for treatment of COVID-19. We're doing some work with histone deacetylase inhibitors with epigenetic reprogramming that increases the presentation of antigens, including viral antigens. This is something that could work as an adjuvant with vaccines. I think what will be fascinating, it will be to understand what impact the response to COVID-19 has had on trial recruitment figures and also in cancer survival. Has this been a temporary blip, or has there been a cavernous drop in terms of the number of patients recruited, the number of trials suspended and so on? And I think the extraordinary response that we've seen around the world of fast-tracking drug trials in COVID-19, how many of what most of us perceive as barriers to clinical research, administrative bureaucratic barriers, have been swept away, and one hopes that they won't return. And again, with, I would say, positive implications for all future clinical research. I finish with this slide, just showing the rather beautiful city of Oxford, where I'm privileged to work in our ancient university. Francis Bacon said in a political context that knowledge is power, and never was that truer in this current age of COVID-19, when each of us is trying to manage their own clinical practice and again to balance the exigencies and demands of clinical cancer research. As always, thanks for listening. Thank you.